Hi guys, and welcome to the second lecture for Chapter 9. In the previous lecture we gave an introduction to what forests were and some of the benefits they provided. Here we're going to be talking about a very specific issue related to forest ecosystems, and that's a form of habitat loss called deforestation. We're going to be talking about what it is specifically, why it is such a problem, where it is such a problem, because deforestation is not evenly distributed around the globe, and then we're going to have a brief introduction of ways to remediate it in ways called forest management, something that we're going to actually be talking about in depth in our next lecture. So deforestation is broadly defined as the loss of tree cover at rates that are faster than they can be replenished. Remember that forests are ecosystems that are dictated by the high number of trees in that ecosystem. So when you lose the trees faster than they can replenish, you actually are eroding that habitat. You are decreasing the actual area or coverage of that habitat, and that can create a whole host of problems. It changes landscapes as well as the ecosystems. Remember that we talked about trees as actually being ecosystem engineers. So as you lose the trees and the tree coverages in the area, you lose the benefits of that ecosystem engineering, and all of a sudden all of those controlled conditions that we talked about are no longer controlled anymore and then fluctuate. And as a result, the habitat that those ecosystem engineers created no longer exists, and the organisms that relied on that habitat can no longer live there. As a result, that reduces biodiversity. In addition to this, one of the ecosystem services that we talked about that forests provide was the provision of oxygen as a result of photosynthesis, as well as the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and into the ground. When we actually remove forests or remove trees from an area, all of that carbon actually gets released back into the atmosphere. So huge carbon reservoirs that have been stored actually are released in the form of carbon dioxide, and this actually accelerates climate change because all of this extra carbon dioxide, these extra greenhouse gases, are being sent back up into the atmosphere. And finally, when you remove the organisms that are facilitating all of these different ecosystem services that we talked about in the previous lecture, you lose all of the ecosystem services that forests provide. And due to the fact that we rely on so many of these ecosystem services, from clean air to clean soils to all of the different organisms that we like to hunt in forests, as well as the provision of clean water, when you lose these ecosystem services, it can become a very serious problem. And forests are being destroyed at alarming rates around the world. We are losing 12.8 million acres of forest each year. That is a staggering amount of area that these habitats are losing each and every year. And deforestation isn't evenly distributed around the globe. Most deforestation happening today is happening in Latin America and Central Africa. And this is a really big problem because in those areas, remember that around the equator in Central America and in Central Africa, as well as parts of Indonesia, those are the areas where we have tropical rainforests. The rainforests, or the ecosystems that have the highest productivity and the highest biodiversity around in the entire globe. So not only are we losing forests, but we're losing our most valuable forests. And this is a huge issue. It's also useful to note that not all forests are created equal, and it's really important to delineate the two types of forests when we talk about where deforestation is located. And there are things called a primary or an old-growth forest, and there's a secondary forest. A primary forest or an old-growth forest are natural forests that have never been cut or there's never been trees removed in that area in any significant capacity by people. These are typically going to be very old and very well-established forests. When we talked about succession back in Chapter 4, these are going to be our climax community forests. And as a result of that long amount of time that these forests have had to mature, they typically have very high biological productivity, very high diversity, and they tend to be very, very resilient to disturbance. They typically have the organisms that are there that can facilitate or can resist any sort of disturbance, be it a storm or a fire, and they tend to be very, very robust ecosystems. Now, contrast that to what we call a secondary growth forest. A secondary growth forest are new forests that have been planted or regrown after removal or after deforestation or cutting. And these are dominated by something called secondary growth trees, which are trees that sprout after old growth timber has been removed and cut. These secondary forests are typically young and not very well established, and as a result, they're not very biologically diverse, they're not quite as productive, and they're much less resilient to disturbance. And this is important to keep in mind because we have lost a lot of our primary forests. The entire eastern half of the continent was once covered by primary or old-growth forests, and you can see here on the left side of the screen back in 1620 the estimated area of old-growth forest. However, almost all of that is lost. The only areas that still have any capacity of primary forest are up in the Rocky Mountains where there aren't a lot of people. Now, we still have a lot of forest in the United States, but all of it has been cut down and regrown. So all of it is going to be secondary growth forests, those younger forests that aren't nearly as well established as the primary forests that were once there. Now, remember how we talked about deforestation is not evenly distributed around the globe. In a lot of locations, we're losing our forests in the areas where they are most valuable, our tropical rainforests. And so essentially deforestation is worst in the developing countries right around the equator, areas that are typically very impoverished and therefore exploiting forest ecosystems simply as a way to maintain some sort of economic significance. And these countries are relying primarily on exporting the raw materials that forests provide. And as a result, a lot of the deforestation that occurs in these countries are deforestation that is done to make way for agriculture as well as population growth. Developing nations have the highest densities of tropical rainforest, and unfortunately these are the areas where deforestation is occurring most. Areas such as Brazil, the Congo, so Central Africa, as well as Indonesia. Anywhere in the areas in red, down in this map figure below on your screen, are areas where deforestation is primarily occurring. When deforestation usually occurs, it normally occurs in the form of habitat fragmentation. Usually agriculture, residential development, roads, logging, any form of action which divides the habitat into small, discontinued fragments. Remember, habitat fragmentation is piecemeal loss or chipping away at the habitat rather than removing huge chunks of habitat in one whole swath. And this is important to note because typically species that need very large habitats disappear first when you lose habitats as a result of habitat fragmentation. Areas that are too small and isolated can no longer be recolonized, and so not only does it remove habitat from the area, but it degrades any existing habitat in a further capacity in a way that wouldn't occur if you kept that habitat continuous. And it's also important to note something called edge effects, which are conditions created along a habitat fragment's edge. Essentially, edges are exposed, and they are exposed to things such as parasites and predators, which can attack organisms that like to reside in that habitat, and so it further degrades the habitats in this area. The example in your book are how predators can easily attack bird nests, and so interior bird species that like continuous habitat can't really reproduce, and it's a cause of major decline in most North American songbirds, for example. Now, transitioning into some of the solutions to deforestation, something that we're really going to talk about in the next lecture for this chapter. There are certain organizations, specifically conservation organizations, that are buying whole swaths of forest in order to preserve them. One organization, Potico, typically steers palm oil companies to land that has already been logged, so steering them towards secondary growth forests instead of primary growth forests, and so it preserves ungrowth forests and sort of promotes sustainability. In addition, RED is another organization that sort of facilitates the purchasing of carbon credits. So wealthy nations or organizations from wealthy nations can pay poor nations to conserve forests, and as a result, these rich nations can get carbon credits as a way to offset their emissions. So it's sort of a win-win. Even though we are still producing carbon emissions, by preserving forests, it cancels out or offsets some of the emissions that we create. In addition, we're really going to be talking about in the next lecture forest management, things such as resource management, ecosystem-based management, and adaptive management strategies to preserve some of our forests. And again, we're going to be talking about this a lot in the next lecture. I hope you enjoyed the topic of deforestation, or I hope you found it interesting, rather. Deforestation is typically a pretty depressing topic. But again, if you have any questions on deforestation or the introduction to forests, any of the two lectures that we've covered thus far, please email me at any time, and I'm happy to go over with it more with you in detail. All right, see you later.